Life had never been easy for me. Every morning felt like a battle. Every night a reminder of the struggles I couldn't escape. Bills stacked up on my kitchen counter like a silent threat, each envelope holding a number I couldn't afford. The fridge hummed in the background, nearly empty except for a half carton of milk and leftovers from 2 days ago. My job barely covered rent, and my father's medical bills drained what little I had left. I sat at my small wooden table, staring at the eviction notice in my hands. My fingers traced the bold, unforgiving words. Final warning. My chest tightened. How had it come to this? No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. The apartment was quiet, aside from the distant sound of footsteps from my neighbor's unit. Mr. Callum lived next door. He was an older man, reserved and quiet. I'd seen him around, usually carrying a newspaper under his arm or sipping coffee on his balcony. We'd never exchanged more than a polite nod. I had never really thought about him, nor had I expected him to think about me. That night, I sat alone in my dimly lit kitchen, my head buried in my hands. My thoughts raced, bouncing between the overdue bills, my father's failing health, and the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. A sharp knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. It startled me. It was late. Who could it be? For a moment I hesitated. Maybe if I ignored it, they'd go away. Another knock. Firmer this time, I wiped my face and forced myself to stand. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the door. Taking a deep breath, I opened it. Mr. Callum stood there. His expression was calm but observant, his eyes scanning my tired face. "I heard you crying," he said simply. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't even realized I had been. I'm fine, I managed to say, embarrassed. He didn't look convinced. His gaze flickered past me, toward the kitchen table, where the pile of unopened bills sat in plain sight. His face softened. "You're struggling, aren't you?" I felt a lump rise in my throat. The instinct to deny it was strong. I didn't want pity. I didn't want anyone to see how broken I felt. But something about the way he asked made it impossible to lie. I swallowed hard and looked away. "It's just been a hard month." He nodded, as if he understood something I wasn't saying. Then, without another word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to me. "Take this," he said. "It's not much, but it might help." I stared at the envelope as if it were a foreign object. My hands trembled as I took it. It was slightly worn, like it had been carried around for a while. Slowly, I peeled it open. My heart pounded as I saw the stack of bills inside. A few $100s, enough to buy food, enough to cover my father's medication, enough to breathe if only for a little while. Tears welled in my eyes. I can't take this," I stammered. "Why are you doing this?" His lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Because once, someone did the same for me." His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. I wanted to ask more, to understand why this man, a near stranger, would extend such kindness. But before I could, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, overwhelmed. That night, I sat at the table, staring at the envelope for what felt like hours. Was this a blessing? A sign? Or just another moment of kindness I'd never be able to repay? I didn't know. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely alone. I hardly slept that night. The weight of the envelope in my hands was heavier than I expected. I turned it over, ran my fingers along its edges, counted the bills again, and placed it back on the table, only to pick it up moments later. A few $100. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to keep the worst from happening. Enough to keep me from completely falling apart. But why? Why would Mr. Callum, someone I barely spoke to, help me like this? By morning, exhaustion clung to my bones, but one thing was clear. I couldn't just take his money without knowing why he had given it to me, without thanking him. So I found myself outside his door, hesitating before knocking. The air smelled like coffee and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there he was, dressed in a sweater and slacks, looking at me with the same calm expression as the night before. "You didn't have to come," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. I swallowed, gripping the envelope in my hands. I needed to say thank you. He nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." His apartment was different from mine. It was warm, filled with soft light and the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. Books lined the shelves, their spines worn from years of being read. A record player sat in the corner, a vinyl spinning lazily as soft jazz filled the space. It felt like stepping into another world, one untouched by the chaos I was drowning in. "Sit," he said, motioning to the couch. "Coffee?" I hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, please." He disappeared into the kitchen, and my eyes landed on a framed photograph on the coffee table. A young man in a military uniform, his smile bright and full of life. Something about the picture pulled at me. "That's my son," Mr. Callum's voice came from the doorway. I turned to see him holding 2 steaming cups. He set one down in front of me before sinking into the chair across from me. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. "He looks kind." "He was," Mr. Callum said, his eyes distant, lost in a memory. "He always believed in helping people, said the world needed more kindness." I took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through me. What happened to him? His fingers tapped against his mug, his gaze flickering toward the window. "He passed away a few years ago. Car accident." His voice didn't break, but there was a quiet pain beneath it. It changed me. For a long time, I didn't know how to go on. Until one day, a stranger helped me, without expecting anything. In return, I felt a lump in my throat. "And now you do the same?" He nodded. "Kindness saved me. It gave me a reason to keep going. So now, whenever I see someone struggling, I try to do what my son would have done." His words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I had spent so long believing I was alone, that no one noticed or cared. But here was this man, someone who had lost everything, choosing to help, to give, to be the kind of person the world so often lacked. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, then back at him. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," he said with a small smile. "Just promise me something." I leaned forward. "Anything. When you're in a position to help someone else, do it." The simplicity of his request took my breath away. Not money, not favors, just a promise to carry kindness forward. I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I will." We sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the coffee and the unspoken understanding between us filling the room. It was the first time in a long time that I felt something close to peace. When I left his apartment that morning, I wasn't just carrying an envelope of money. I was carrying something far greater, a purpose, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness had the power to change everything. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. What if the person you ignored every day was the one who could change your life forever? As I stepped out of Mr. Callum's apartment, my mind felt tangled. His story had shifted something inside me. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the way kindness could echo through time, how one moment of compassion could change everything. But still, a question burned inside me. Who was the stranger that had helped him? Why had he chosen to live by this rule of passing kindness? Forward, something told me there was more to his story. Something deeper hidden beneath his calm eyes and quiet demeanor. The next day, I found myself knocking on his door again. This time, he didn't look surprised. He opened it, glanced at me, then wordlessly stepped aside to let me in. "I have coffee brewing," he said. I sat on the same couch as before, watching him move around his kitchen with ease. I didn't know how to start, but I knew I had to ask. "Who helped you?" I finally blurted out. "The person who changed your life?" He stilled for a moment, then exhaled slowly. Carrying 2 cups, he walked over and sat across from me, his fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug, as if holding on to something unseen. "It was a stranger," he said, staring into the dark liquid. "Years ago, after my son passed, I lost everything. Not just him, but myself. I quit my job, stopped seeing friends. I barely ate. Every day felt like it was dragging me deeper into a pit I couldn't climb out of. I swallowed hard, listening. One night, I found myself on a park bench, just sitting there. I don't even know how long I was there. Hours, maybe. Maybe longer. I didn't care anymore. Then, a man sat beside me. Just a regular man. Nothing special about him. He didn't ask me what was wrong. He didn't pry. He just sat there, silent, for a long time. I leaned in, hanging on to every word. After a while, he pulled something from his coat pocket and placed it beside me. It was an old, crumpled note. I looked at it, then at him, but he was already walking away. I almost didn't read it, but something told me I should. He paused, his fingers tightening around the mug. It said, "If you still have a heartbeat, you still have a purpose." I felt chills run down my spine. "That note saved me," he continued, his voice quiet. It was such a small thing, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that I was still here. That maybe, just maybe, my life still had meaning. I swallowed, my throat thick with emotion. "And you never saw him again?" He shook his head. "Never. I don't know his name, don't know his story. But that moment, his presence, his kindness, was enough to pull me back." Silence filled the room, heavy but not uncomfortable. After that, I promised myself that if I ever saw someone struggling, I wouldn't look away. I would do something, because you never know when one small act of kindness might save someone's life. His words struck me like a bolt of lightning. How many times had I walked past people without noticing? How many times had I been so wrapped up in my own struggles that I failed to see someone else drowning too? I thought about all the strangers I had passed on my way to work, the cashier at the grocery store who always looked exhausted, the old woman who sat alone on the park bench every morning. How many of them were waiting for someone to notice them the way that man had noticed Mr. Callum? My chest felt tight, not from sadness, but from something else. Determination. I looked at him, this man who had once been a stranger to me, and realized something. He wasn't just helping me. He was teaching me. "Thank you," I whispered. He smiled. "Just don't forget the promise." And I wouldn't, because kindness wasn't just about giving money or grand gestures. Sometimes, it was as simple as sitting beside someone in their darkest moment. Sometimes, it was a note that reminded them they still mattered. And sometimes, it was a neighbor knocking on your door at just the right time, changing everything. Watch till the end, because one small act of kindness can start a ripple that never stops. What if one choice, just one, could change the course of your life forever? Days passed, but Mr. Callum's words never left my mind. His story had planted something inside me, a seed of realization that refused to stay buried. I had spent so long believing I was alone in my struggles, blind to the fact that there were others carrying invisible burdens too. But now, I saw them everywhere. At the grocery store, the young mother struggling to count change at the register, her child tugging at her sleeve, asking for a candy bar she clearly couldn't afford. The old man sitting alone in the park, staring at nothing in particular. His eyes filled with an emptiness I recognized all too well. The me from a week ago would have looked away. But not now. Something inside me had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't want to feel powerless anymore. So, I made a decision. It started small. At the grocery store, I slipped a few dollars onto the counter when the mother wasn't looking. The way her face lit up when the cashier told her she had enough, it was like watching hope flicker back to life. At the cafe, I paid for a stranger's coffee, just to see the surprise and warmth in their eyes when the barista told them it was taken care of. And at the park, I sat next to the old man, just like that stranger had once done for Mr. Callum. I didn't say anything at first, just sat. Let him know in the simplest way possible that he wasn't alone. It felt different, like I was seeing the world with new eyes. But the real test came one evening when I got home to find Mr. Callum waiting outside my door. "I need your help," he said. I tensed. Those were words I wasn't used to hearing. I had spent my whole life needing help, not being the one to offer it. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart pounding. "There's a boy," he said. He just moved into the building with his mother. I overheard her talking to the landlord. She lost her job. They might not have enough for rent next month. A strange sensation washed over me. It was a moment of choice. I could nod, say that was unfortunate, and go inside. Pretend I hadn't heard, or I could do something. I took a deep breath. "What do you think we should do?" A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. And just like that, I realized something. I had spent my whole life waiting for someone to save me. But maybe the real secret was this. Sometimes, you had to be the one to start the ripple. Watch till the end, because sometimes the help you give others is the help you once wished for yourself. What if the kindness you gave today came back to change your life in ways you never imagined? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the boy Mr. Callum had mentioned, the one whose mother was struggling, just like I had been days ago. I knew what it felt like to stare at an eviction notice, to wonder if tomorrow would mean losing everything, to feel invisible. And I knew, without a doubt, I couldn't just stand by. The next morning, I knocked on Mr. Callum's door before I could talk myself out of it. He opened it with a knowing look, as if he already sensed why I was there. "What's the plan?" I asked. His lips curled into a small smile. "Now you're starting to get it." We started small. A bag of groceries left outside their door. A gift card for a local store, slipped under their welcome mat. The boy, no older than 10, always looked surprised when he found them, his wide eyes scanning the hallway as if trying to catch whoever was behind it. Then, one evening, I saw him sitting alone on the steps outside the building, kicking at the concrete. Something in me hesitated. A week ago, I would have walked past, but I wasn't that person anymore. I walked over and sat next to him. "Hey," I said. He glanced at me, then back down at his shoes. "Hey." For a while, we just sat there. The air was thick with the quiet hum of the city, the distant sounds of cars and muffled conversations floating through the night. Then softly he said, "I know it's you." I froze. What? The groceries, the gift card, the extra snacks outside our door. My mom says it's just a lucky blessing, but I know it's you. My heart pounded. How? He shrugged. Because you look at us the way people look, at things they understand. His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. Maybe I just think you deserve a little luck. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I recognized. Hope. A week ago, I had been the one drowning. And now, somehow, I was the one helping someone else stay afloat. That's when I realized this wasn't just about repaying kindness. It was about continuing it, passing it forward, over and over, until it became something bigger than any of us. Mr. Callum had saved me. A stranger had once saved him. And now, maybe, just maybe, I was helping this boy in a way he'd remember years from now. Because kindness never stops at one person. It moves. It spreads. It reaches places we'll never even see. As I stood up, I turned to the boy and said, "One day, when you see someone struggling, promise me you'll do the same." He nodded, eyes full of something that looked a lot like understanding. And that's when I knew. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Watch. Till the end. Because the kindness you give today might be the miracle someone else needs tomorrow.